LLMs are really good at writing crappy software on demand for basically free. So like, it's not good software often unless you have the right structures and approaches and the right kind of scaffolding to make sure that it's doing the thing that you wanted, like what you all were building. And that these radically change how we think of where you would apply software and how you would apply it.
You're listening to the AI Native Dev, brought to you by Tessl. Hello, Simon Maple here, and welcome to another episode of the AI Native Dev. We have a special one for you this time around as we reshare an AI Native DevCon session, the one where Dion has a chat with Alex Komoroske about the AI developer ecosystem. Now, one of the reasons why we want to share this session is because we actually have a new AI Native DevCon event fast approaching on May 13th. 2025. It's our spring edition, so yeah, we'll be also having a fall edition later in November 2025. At the time of recording, the CFP, the call for papers, and the registration are both open, so head to ainativedev.io/events where you can submit your proposals to speak at the event, as well as of course snag your ticket and your spot for the event as well. It's free to join us. So with that, be sure to subscribe and like the video if you're watching it on YouTube, and I'll hand over to Dion and Alex.
Hey, how's it going, Alex?
Good, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks so much for joining us, a little early your time. Whereabouts are you?
I am in Berkeley.
Oh, very nice. That's good. So yeah, how did Bits and Bobs come about actually? Was I right in that?
Yeah, so I have the compendium, which is that sort of custom web app I built over the last number of years to organize my thoughts. And if you look at the compendium live, you'll think that it's dead. I haven't added anything to it for years. I actually have it open every day, and I add hundreds of notes to it every day in my private working notes area. I use embeddings to help me find commonalities across different ideas. And then each week I go and spend a few hours on the weekends when the kids are napping, and I distill out the notes from that week that resonate with me, and I develop them a little bit. And it started off actually as believe it or not, as a practice. A very early version of it was when I used to report to Clay Bavor, who recently founded that Sierra with Brett Taylor. I would send an email on Monday to him of here's the people I'm meeting with, here's the things that I'm doing, and here's a few takeaways, so like interesting ideas I think you might find relevant. And then I continued that practice at Stripe. And then that section got deeper and deeper and longer. And I started sharing it with more and more people in my internal little strategy study groups, and then into internal blogs. And then I started publishing external, because I would do all that reflection on my own personal time. And yeah, now it's a document that has a stupid number of pages in it. And it's really slow. One of the things that happens is people, when they're searching in it, it takes so long to load that they're searching, and Google Docs will think that they're typing into the document. And so it suggests a random edit to the document because they're actually just searching for something in the document. So that happens like once a day. I think I'm probably going to split. It's, I think, 700 pages or something. And I add like 20 pages or so a week, which is just silly.
Yeah, I know. It's probably one of their stress tests. So we're going to get into talking about the future, but curious actually to start with the past a little bit. Like with this round of AI and kind of Gen AI, when did this first hit home for you? Were you super skeptical at first, and was there a bit of an aha moment that got you thinking like maybe there's something real here?
Yeah, I've been following obviously all the papers and interesting developments at Google Research and others for many years, and watching it slowly plod along, and some of the silly things that people were doing with the earlier version of chatbots. And the moment it really hit home for me, though, is I have a few groups of people I facilitate, of interesting thinkers I just like talking to and having collaborative debate with. And once a year or so, we would get an Airbnb in the woods, and we would go and we just have a few days, like 12 people, just for an interesting long-term discussion about what's going to happen in the next decade about crypto, and not just for crypto, but for all of society. And then the next year we did generative AI. And that was, I think, a few weeks before ChatGPT came out. And we had a number of folks, good friends, people who as well. In this session, it's just like 3 days of just thinking and pulling on threads. And afterwards, I would sit down and I would just write 60 pages of here's what I took away from that discussion. And I remember writing down and being like, holy shit, like this is going to change everything. And it's on the cusp of it. So many things change that people haven't even realized yet. And then a few weeks later, ChatGPT comes out, and it was like, just like, starting bell for everybody. And I knew at that point that like this was going to be like, LLMs are not some flash in the pan. They are not some random technology. Like, they are a fundamental disruptive innovation. And I think you need to act like it. I think a lot of people are acting like AI is a sustaining innovation. And I don't think that's true at all. I think it radically changes a number of things that we haven't even, we're like Wile E. Coyote out over the cliff as an industry. We're like, oh, we're just going to slap some AI on this. That's not how that works at all. It actually changes fundamentally the way that we write software, the way that we can experience things, and it changes the cost structures of everything. It's a really interesting and fascinating thing. But it was that period right before ChatGPT came out that I was like, oh wow.
Got it. That's awesome. So this event is called AI Native Dev. And it can be a little bit of a double entendre, can mean different things. I'm curious what that means for you.
I think people are currently they're just jamming AI on the sides of the way that they built software before and the way that they would approach problems. And I think when you embrace LLMs, you write software differently and you think of it, it's almost like, how do you pull the software out of the mind of this LLM? And you do it in a way that's not traditional collaborating with another person. You do it a lot more like what Tessla's doing, I think, of like specs and this designing a thing. Like, I had a silly little example. There's this game called Skyjo. That's a fun little card game. And we were playing it and I got really into it. I realized, oh, if you could count the cards going through, you could strategically be making better calls. And so I wanted to make a little web app to make it so you could just keep track of the cards that had been played out of the deck, and it would tell you the probabilities of different cards coming up or whatever. And this is the kind of thing that would have taken me a few hours on a weekend to sit down, create a new project from scratch, and like slowly add in stuff. And what I did instead was I built it in 10 minutes, and I just used Anthropic artifacts. And I did exactly the way I would have done it. I said, first, write a little function that does this. Okay, now put that function in this. Now add TypeScript typing that allows like that. Now, I just told it what I would have done for each of the individual steps. And in 10 minutes, you have this really nicely styled thing that has undo and save and all these little features. And I built it like not by writing any code, but by just coaxing it in the right order with the right steps and things I wanted to do. And that felt like a radically different way of building software to me than sitting down and writing this silly little hobby project that would have taken me a few hours to do.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of app, like this notion of I think some people are like micro apps and the like, is going to change the way that a bunch of even like users and non-developers, maybe even getting into this world where they can scratch their own itches, where like at the moment, maybe they just like, I could do spreadsheets. So I try and use a spreadsheet to do everything that I can. Like they have these different tools, but they don't feel like they can create custom software.
I think it will, but for a couple of reasons. So a friend of mine is not particularly technical, and they knew I was super in playing around with AI. And they said, I want to see what it can do. I want to have it program. And so we went to ChatGPT, and they were saying a thing they wanted to do, and then they'd give it the HTML, and I'd copy and paste it into a thing, and then load it into a separate tab. And that step mystified him because I don't understand what's happening. And the feedback loop just took enough time to like copy paste. And then sometimes it would tell you have to like surgically put it back in the code back into because it would only update a small portion of it. And then we switched to Anthropic that has artifacts. And that was basically the same loop, just in a live preview. And that radically changed it. Instead of it feeling of me hand-holding him, he just sat there and was doing little things and experimenting with it. And I left and I came back 20 minutes later and he built a relatively complex little toy app. And he was like, I guess I'm a programmer now. I was like, yeah, sure. But it felt like this immediacy, I think, felt really nice. I think by default, what we'll see with AI and the current distribution physics is we'll see a proliferation of both hyper-centralized hyper aggregators and profusion of lots of little micro apps that are like little toys that they don't really do that much on their own. I think the real trick will be how can you figure out a system that allows these micro apps to add up to something much larger than some of their parts, to interact with other micro apps and to other experiences and have this emergent possibility. That's quite challenging. I think it requires a fundamentally different kind of like substrate to be built on. And that's one of the things that we're working on. So much of software, so much of the industry is predicated on the idea that software is expensive to write and cheap to run. And LLMs mess with both of these assumptions because code that uses LLMs to execute, which is not all code in the future, but a fair bit of it, that now has a marginal cost that is above zero, which means it is expensive in some significant way that we're not used to. And secondarily, LLMs are really good at writing crappy software on demand for basically free. So it's not good software often, unless you have the right structures and approaches and the right kind of scaffolding to make sure that it's doing the thing that you wanted, like what you all were building. But it is these radically change how we think of where you would apply software and how you would apply it. Clay Shirky has this old essay from, I think it's 2007, called Situated Software. And it's now off the internet. Gwern has a mirror of it. It's a great essay. And it talks about situated software as software that is situated to a hyper-specific context. So anytime you've written a spreadsheet formula, it's situated software. It's situated specifically in the context of this particular spreadsheet. And anytime that someone looks at someone else's bit of situated software, they go, that's a piece of crap. It barely works. It's insecure. It's ugly. But to the person who built it, it's perfect. It does exactly and precisely what they need. And sometimes in those contexts, actually, what happens if that breaks? Is that, I don't know, I'll just slap some more situated software on the side. And especially when LLMs can help you write the situated software, you can get software that's just right. It's just the right size for you, as opposed to this one size fits none software that we have today in our modern era.
Yeah, that makes sense. Some people I see snarky about, I can just do these little toy things, right? You stay in your zone, stay in the micro apps era. I'm an amazing expert developer and you're never going to be able to touch me and the domain that I understand and my enterprise software and the like. How do you think over time, especially like LLMs are actually going to be able to help, in very broad ways across of the spectrum of development that's out there? Or do you think it will never?
Oh, no, it will for sure. And I think folks like Tessl and others are really pushing the limits of what you can get. I think the big story, by the way, the last year, people talk about the quality improvements. To me, it's the context length improvements. That just radically changes the kinds of questions you can ask. If you wanted to ask before of a large book, what are the major themes of this book? You can't answer it with RAG. It's not possible because it's not like there's this is the theme and that's in the embedding. Like you have to have a broad context. And the more that you have this broad context, the more that you can see these subtle patterns, keep track of and understand where things are going. And so I feel like we're just at the beginning stages of figuring out how to get LLMs to build large bits of software. I also think one of the things that's exciting about Tessl's approach is LLMs, one of their superpowers is they're really good at translation. And you can translate English to code. And so before, like the spec is not just some little documentation. It actually is almost the primary semantic thing. And the actual code is, I think, like compiling the spec into code. And it's unlike a normal compiler where everyone who's learned C at the beginning, at a certain point says the compiler is broken. It's like, I can guarantee you this compiler is not broken for this case. So you learn that the compiler is almost always trustworthy. With LLMs, like it can get confused. And the thing it gets confused on most is when it's not high locality of the code, when it's in multiple files, it has to coordinate based on a specific phrase or word that has to be consistent in these multiple places. LLMs tend to kind of get a little bit confused by that kind of situation, but there's ways of adding scaffolding and idioms to make it so that they are more likely to stay to a pretty good answer.
Yeah, I think one of my realizations around this was feeling like I was using English to poke at things, just like you were talking about, but then all of that information was lost. It was like in the chat session and it was gone. And it was like, but that was like my actual requirement. Like,
it's like recording the steps of things to get to that result. Yeah.
So it felt like I'm compiling this thing and then just taking my compiled output with me.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, isn't the other thing the important thing to stay around? So what if that could be the canonical piece instead? So that's why specs made a lot of sense to me. As you've poked around with all these things, what have you found? You've mentioned some of these, like LLMs to be particularly good at or bad at when it comes to coding and development in general.
One way to think about this is in Jurassic Park, when they have gaps in the dinosaur DNA and it fills it in with frog DNA, kind of. LLMs do that too, where if you don't bring the specific examples, it just assumes based on the most generic background information of how it fits in. So they do really well. If you're writing it in the same kind of React style that everybody else writes it, they're really good at that because they've got tons of frog DNA to bring into your particular situation to get really good results. If you're writing an algorithm that's been represented is like nicely, cleanly separated and exists in lots of tutorials and Wikipedia articles or whatever, they're also pretty good at reproducing that. When you have an architecture, like a relatively large architecture that is slightly atypical or it has some weird stylistic and calling ways it's been designed, architected, they start getting a little bit funky there and a little bit like they can lose the plot a bit. Remember that like LLMs can't count, and it's a miracle in some ways that they work reasonably, that they can handle some of these cases. One of the reasons, like really deeply nested JSON, they lose track of, wait, am I in an object context or an array context? And they'll like nest some of the things, partially because it's just really hard to keep track of the counting. One way of looking at this is they do a really good job of they've seen objects like that. So smaller chunks of JSON that are shaped roughly like that. There's been way more examples because presumably the JSON you'd see on the web has a logarithmic kind of fall off of like the larger sizes get increasingly less common. And so it doesn't have as much training data to keep track of, and it can't fundamentally count. And so it just kind of loses track of, and just, remember, it's all like vibes-based programming. It's just its vibes are extremely dialed in.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because like you mentioned, there's a lot of React code on the internet that has ended up in these models and the like. And then I start to think about the frog DNA. Do we have the kind of meh frog? Because most of the DNA that's gotten in there with React code is from the average React developer, not like the React core developer that's out there. And so is there like that magical piece of like actually the shark DNA that hasn't evolved that much, right? It's like it's just gotten really good and honed in. And so you really want something that's good enough, that's got enough content that's out there, but is also really focused. I'm really curious about the notion of also just like king making as well. If we created a brand new language today, do we have a chance to make it? And how do you think about the role of data and quality data and golden path data, all of those things with LLMs?
I love the shark data. I just writing that down. LLMs are really good at imitation. They're so insanely good at imitation that it sometimes looks like innovation, but they're really fundamentally kind of conceptually interpolating across just a very wide swath of human experience and examples. And that does feel like it pulls us towards the center, right? It pulls us towards the average mushy center. Like when you, in its writing, its default writing style is like corporate speak, because that's the mushy center that at the core, like the random bland heat death average kind of. And we get the same thing in programming where we're just kind of, I'm just going to use React. I'm going to just do it whatever the most basic way that you can possibly, like basic in the pejorative sense. And I do think one thing that's interesting and challenging, like one of the ways that it knows how to weight what things are good is like things that have worked for others in the past are more likely to be replicated and other people to also talk about them and write about them. And so LLMs aren't random sampling all text that could exist. They're random sampling the text that humans have found useful enough to propagate, right? And you have this natural thing where humans are selecting to some degree the thing that it's reading off of. But over time, as more and more that selection is done from like this just Bayesian kind of averaging process, you lose some of that signal. And it does feel like it will pull us more towards the centroid. It also does feel like, to me, it will be much harder to escape local maxima, because it's just, in default, if I don't have a strong opinion about how to write this bit of code, and I said, do a thing that has this behavior, what's it going to reach for? It's going to reach for the most obvious basic answer of that and put it in there. And I don't have a strong opinion, so I'm not going to go through, no, do it in this other style that I think is interesting. And so that's fine. And so now you'll have yet another piece that is now put onto the whole collection of
that's funny. Now I'm thinking about how to nudge selection to be like, this software passes tests a lot versus what are the other parts of selection that could help nudge things fast. So I've noticed in the past you've mentioned that spending time to define requirements saves extraordinary amounts of time. And so I'm just curious, what does requirement, just like when we talk about specs, it means lots of different things to different people. Like, what do you mean by that?
I think it's partially that one's my direct experience in the last few weeks. And I realized it's a pattern I've seen many times. Like, oh, we understand how to build this. I've got the idea in my head. We will simply execute this. It turns out explaining the requirements, like you have like this hyper object in your head of like, this should work and all the pieces of it like this. And explaining it to other people is like a serialization process. It takes so long. And it's like a combinatorial kind of thing to really serialize it perfectly. And the way to communicate it is then factor that serialization into higher level requirements, which is a process that takes a ton of time. And so you're always like, oh, we're fine. We're just gonna wing it. I'm just gonna give them enough guidance or whatever. But if you do this improperly, you're like, oh, we'll go fast by not doing the requirements or factoring out the worker requirements. And then what you end up with is you realize later that people didn't understand the fundamental thing you're trying to do, and they went in these other weird corners, and you have to like, no, actually, there's the whole thing. You can't do it that way. You got to do it this way. And they go, okay, cool. I had to throw out this entire thing I just did now. And so to them, it feels like a total thrash. And the mental model in my head is like a dynamic programming problem without memorization done in exactly the wrong order. So each calculation you're doing 20 times, 30 times or whatever. And that's what it feels like to do the requirements. Like to read the requirements process is taking the serialization of the hyperobject and then distilling it into a more abstract and condensed version that can be efficiently communicated to somebody else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Some developers initially got excited about having these new tools. Some developers got a little bit nervous at first of, is AI going to take my job? And that whole meme. When you look ahead 5-10 years out there, like what aspects do you think of software development are going to remain fundamentally human driven? And what parts do you think we're going to be somewhat happy to pass over to be AI driven?
Yeah, I think that I'm personally excited about AI as a tool for human creativity because it takes the bland drudgery and allows you to handle those parts. The parts that aren't exciting or aren't interesting, aren't surprising to you in any way, it just allows you to execute on those way faster. And one of the powers of infrastructure in general, one of the reasons infrastructure works and creates value in the world is instead of every single individual customer having to build their own lower layers, you can build it once and share it across many. You write it once, you share it with many, so everybody's getting that value, but the cost is a single instance of it. So you're factoring out the most boring parts of lots of people's jobs. LLMs also factor out the most boring parts, the parts that are just the mundane drudgery. And I think that if you use them properly and see them as a tool to extend your creativity, they allow you to do other interesting new things. Like I've heard a number of people have told me they've started writing poetry. And they're like, yeah, I used to like it in like high school. I haven't done it in a while. And now I've got like a brainstorming writing partner that helps me come up with a better rhyme for that, or 8 different examples of this, or critique the thing with that. It's like, if I show the poetry, even to my spouse, I don't want to show them like a shitty writer. And so I think it's those kinds of things that allow people to stretch further. And I think that it's an active choice. It is also just as easy to take those tools and become increasingly passive and increasingly like, cool, now I have to think very hard. No, I think you should use these tools to help you think harder.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we both spent a lot of our careers working on the web platform, as we mentioned at the beginning. And I think we both had a love towards the kind of openness of that era. And then we got to see mobile, which Guy mentioned this in the keynote, was a slightly different shape of openness, which had different effects. As someone who like really studies ecosystem dynamics and the like, how do you think AI is going to potentially change the landscape as it comes to what can happen to the existing ecosystems? Like, how's this going to affect the web and mobile? And what opportunities it maybe give us in the future to have change?
Yeah, I think that typically the like decentralization, centralization is like a TikTok. It's at the beginning stage of a new disruptive paradigm. It's open and decentralized, and then later it centralizes as the best patterns are found and become like the compounding advantage to the ones who are best at it gets stronger and stronger. And you get to a really boring part with that. There's just everything interesting has been done. Like there's no space for innovation. It's just, I don't know, if one of these 3 big players think that it's allowed to exist, then it's allowed to exist. That's insane to me. And so I think that's one of my hopes of AI as a disruptive innovation is that it resets and gives you into this open-ended, decentralized world to start again. I think in some ways AI, there was a real danger like a year and a half ago, I thought that AI would be an inherently centralizing technology. It's so capital intensive that like only a very small number of companies can possibly invest the capital. And then now they become the only ones that can train and host these large models. And that was a very real possibility. Like I think looking at a year and a half ago, there was a really real possibility that OpenAI would just be the hyper aggregator, the apex aggregator to rule them all in this new world. And we jump straight from centralized to hyper centralized, and like that would be it. And I think very encouragingly for society, one, Anthropic built a better model. Sonnet 3.5 is my daily driver. I use it every day. I use it all the time. It's like arguably a better model on a number of fronts, which means now there's at least there's multiple horses in the race. Gemini has been making a lot of really interesting progress. And then Zuckerberg comes along and Meta just goes, hey, here's an open weights model that is actually one of the best in class, which really scrambles all the dynamics in a really healthy way. What I think happens now is instead of the AI model producers having this extreme centralizing force, they look a lot more like, to me, like cell network providers of extremely capital intensive and also not that much pricing power because they're basically commodities and you have lots of different options to pick from, which is, I think, really beneficial for society because those individual operators don't have that much strategic power, but all of us benefit from there being a nice competition and allows an open ecosystem to thrive on top of that. One of the bets I was asserting a year ago is companies that take AI for granted can do some really interesting things. If you are fighting to build frontier models that compete with the big ones, wow, that is a really tough space to be in. But if you say, I'm just going to assume that there's going to be good competition and there will be multiple good, cheap options to pick from, and that competition will drive the quality up and the cost down consistently, that's a pretty safe assumption. I don't care who wins. I don't care which ones of these are better. I just know that there will be good, high quality, cheap models to use. And that seems like a pretty safe assumption at this point, which allows an open ecosystem on top, which I think is enormously exciting for society.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then another thing that I love about the web ecosystem is browser extensions of all things. Like it felt like you've got this aftermarket kind of approach where I can come along and someone can build a thing that changes the thing for me. And do you think AI ecosystems are going to allow for maybe a more personal custom experiences that I can maybe experience the StreamYard system that I'm in now with a few different tweaks without having to persuade that company to make that change for me, which obviously doesn't scale?
I think so. And I think back to Grease Monkey. I think Grease Monkey was one of the golden eras of the browser, of these little scripts that you could put in. And one of my good friends used to run userscripts.org, which was the kind of centralized community for that. And I think Grease Monkey was really powerful. The problem with Grease Monkey ultimately was it was insecure, and fundamentally so. And even as a savvy user, choosing a set of scripts to put in your thing, there's a curve that looks like this. Like I'll only install 10 of these because I have to really trust that they aren't going to mess with my Gmail or sell my data or whatever. And I think the trick is, how can you get that kind of thing? And I would never tell my dad to install it. My God, can you imagine what terrible, crazy stuff he would have installed in running Grease Monkey? So how do you change the security and privacy model to make it so that actually it's just a purely, keep on going and the sky's the limit and everybody should be able to tweak? I think that's possible, but requires thinking about the security and privacy models. It can't just be like duct taped on to the existing privacy models.
Got it. Makes sense. Okay, I noticed there's some questions that have been asked here, so I want to get to them so I don't take all of your time. Min asked, how does a developer new to creating a micro app ensure that the code created is of good quality and safe? Are there known techniques to use when interacting with an LLM?
This is one of the things that is why micro apps are useful in this context. Certain code when it's compiled, if it compiles, there's a pretty good chance it at least does something correct. And this is also, by the way, is a nice loop for LLMs. If it doesn't compile, you tell it back to the LLM, here's the code you gave me, here's the compile error, fix it, and it can do a pretty good job. That's like kind of automated smoke testing. The problem is like the semantics, to get the semantics of the thing correct. And one of the nice things about little micro apps, and one of the reasons they're a sweet spot, is because you can just poke at it and you poke the 5 buttons in the right order. Does it do the thing I expected? There's not too many, like the combinatorial space of possibilities isn't that large, but you have to go to interact with it and poke at it and go, yeah, that does the thing I wanted. Or no, wait a second, I hit this button and it did the thing that's wrong. Try again, LLM. But like the bigger it gets, the more likely that you've gotten something wrong. And that's where the importance of testing becomes extraordinarily important. And I think one of the reasons that what you all are doing is really interesting is, if you write the spec, it's also easy to write the tests. And I find that like the biggest reason people don't write tests in practice, because it's such a slog and it's such a pain in the butt, and you're doing it in a way that feels very different than writing the code. It feels like only attacks, but it is the thing that allows you to go fast later. LLMs also are, honestly, they don't get bored. They're really willing to write the boring, annoying tests. And maybe it's not exactly correct, but it's more likely to catch a thing that is wrong in the future. And like maybe you dive in to go, oh, wait, this test was wrong. But that's the thing that gives you that the sort of smoke test that helps you know that I should dive in and try to debug.
Yeah. Okay. Anthony asked, what are the best examples you've seen of stringing together micro apps or their functions? Incumbents today like Zapier for workflows comes to mind.
I think we are not even in the first inning of this. I feel like so far we're seeing really interesting stuff like GitHub Spark is interesting. And obviously Anthropic Artifacts was interesting. And what Marcel's doing with V0 is super interesting. But these are all individual micro apps. They aren't even distributable necessarily. Like for Anthropic, it's almost an afterthought that you can distribute the artifact, and others you can't. And so I don't think we know what good looks like in this yet. I think that there is because we haven't even started. We as an ecosystem have discovered that micro apps are a sweet spot for LLMs, but we haven't yet figured out like what to do with that. Okay, in a world of lots of micro apps, how do you stitch them together? I think that's an open question that no one has really gotten a good handle on yet.
Yeah. Awesome. Alex, thanks so much for taking the time. I could talk to you for hours about this stuff. It's been really fun.
for having me.
And yeah, find Alex online. Can't wait to hear more about your startup. It's called Common Tools. Is that
That's
right?
Yep.
Yeah. Super excited about that. And yeah, join the Discord and ask questions there too. And we'll be looking over it. But Alex, thanks so much.
Of course. Great seeing you. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
A big thank you there to Dion and Alex. And a reminder that the call for papers for the AI Native DevCon Spring Edition, that's happening on May 13th, is still open at the time of recording, as well as registrations. So head to ainativedev.io/events, where you can submit your proposals to speak for the event, as well as snag your tickets for the event as well for free. So thanks for listening to the episode of the AI Native Dev, and be sure to subscribe, as well as hit that thumbs up if you're on YouTube, and tune in to the next episode. Bye for now. Thanks for tuning in. Join us next time on the AI Native Dev, brought to you by Tessl.